Okay guys, so this is a video going over quiz 18 and 19 that were combined. So I'm going to cover quiz 18 in the first video, and the second video is over quiz 19. And I'm just going to walk through each problem step by step, so you'll have an explanation for each one if you weren't sure how to get that correct answer. So number one is if A and B are legs and C is the hypotenuse, the Pythagorean theorem can be written as. It gives you several choices. So just remember, the Pythagorean theorem is only used for right triangles. When you're given two parts, either a leg or hypotenuse or two legs, you could figure out the missing side. So with Matthew C, he states it simply as leg squared plus leg squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. So if the legs in this problem are A and B, so A and B and the hypotenuse is C, then the Pythagorean theorem could be written as A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared, which would be the same as leg squared plus leg squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. So number one would be D. Okay, number two. If the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the legs, we know what? So that is harder when it's written out in words compared to just seeing it as an equation. So if the square of the hypotenuse, so the hypotenuse squared, is equal to the sum of the square of the legs, so the leg squared, then we know what? Well, right here we've written out the Pythagorean theorem. And remember, the Pythagorean theorem can only be used for right triangles. So we would know that this triangle is a right triangle, which is C. Okay, number three. If the legs of a right triangle are 3 and 2, the hypotenuse is closest to what number? So, legs of a triangle, so 3 and 2, what is our hypotenuse? So we're going to plug it into our Pythagorean theorem. 3 squared plus 2 squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. So 3 squared is equal to 9. 2 squared is equal to 4. So 9 plus 4 is 13. And to solve for that, you take the square root of each side. So the hypotenuse is equal to the square root of 13. So this is where we practice estimating. So think about our perfect squares. 2 squared is 4, or it'd be the square root of 4, would be 2. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 13 falls somewhere in between the square root of 9 and the square root of 16. So it's going to be in between 3 and 4. Well, they don't have 3 as an option, so we would want to go with 4. But we could even know it actually is closer to 4, because 13 is 4 away from 9, and it's only 3 away from 16, so it's going to be closer to the 4 end. So the answer would be D. It's closer to 4. Okay, number 4. If the legs of a right triangle are A and B, the length of the hypotenuse is what? Okay, so if the legs of a triangle are A and B, how would you write that out for the hypotenuse? And they also said a right triangle, so we know we can use the Pythagorean theorem. So A squared plus B squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. And the way we would solve for this to figure out the hypotenuse is you take the square root to undo the squared symbol. And you take the square root of that side. So that cancels out there, and you're left with hypotenuse is equal to the square root of A squared plus B squared. And the reason you can't simplify any further is because it's being added together. We don't know the number value, so we just have to leave it as this. We can't say that that cancels out and that cancels out and we have A plus B. So we have to leave it like this until we know further values to plug in. So the answer would be C for number 4. Okay, number 5, a right triangle has legs of 3 and 7. What is the length of the hypotenuse? So 3 squared plus 7 squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. What is the length of the hypotenuse? So 3 squared is 9, 7 squared is 49. 9 plus 49 is 58. And we're going to take the square root. So hypotenuse is equal to square root of 58. The next thing we want to know is there anything that we can reduce this to? Of course, square root of 58 is not a perfect square. 4 will not go into it evenly. It'll go into 5 one time, and you're left with 18, which isn't even. 9 doesn't go into it. And 16 times 3 is 48, so it does not go to it evenly. And then 25, of course, does not go into it evenly. So that's as simple as a square root of 58 gets. So the length of the hypotenuse would be square root of 58, which is B. Okay, number 6, a right triangle has legs of 4 and 6. What is the length of the hypotenuse in simplest form? So 4 squared plus 6 squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. So 16 plus 36. And 16 plus 36 is 52. Still equal to hypotenuse squared. So to undo the square, here you have to do a square root, and you have to do it to each side. So the hypotenuse is equal to the square root of 52. Now I want to see if this can be any simpler. And 4 can go into it evenly. So let's try that. So 4 goes into 52 13 times. So this simplifies the square root of 4 times the square root of 13. The square root of 4 is equal to 2, and then still square root of 13. So the hypotenuse is 2 times the square root of 13, which is E. Okay, number 7. A triangle has legs of 6, 8, and 10. Which of the following is true? It has an obtuse angle. It is not a right angle. It is a right angle. None of the angles can be determined. It is equilateral. Well, first thing is just thinking about what the quiz is we're taking. It's over right triangles and Pythagorean theorem. 2 is, we know that they just gave us the legs are 3 different lengths. An equilateral triangle, as stated in E, has to have legs of all the same length, or sides of all the same length. So we know that it's not equilateral, so we can mark off E. Next is B and C. It is not a right triangle, or it is a right triangle. Well, a triangle has to be one or the other. So just because those are so mutually exclusive, one of those has to be the correct answer. So remember the way we tell if they give us the legs and we tell if it is a right triangle or not is plug into the Pythagorean theorem. So the longest side is always going to be what we would assume to be the hypotenuse. So when we start with our leg squared plus leg squared equal hypotenuse squared, we would say 6 squared plus 8 squared, and then our hypotenuse would be 10, so 10 squared. So 6 squared is 36, 8 squared is 64, 10 squared is 100. 36 plus 64 is 100. So these equal out. So remember, if we can plug this into the Pythagorean theorem, each of the values, and they equal each other at the end, then that means it is a right triangle. So the answer to 7 is C. It is a right triangle. Okay, number 8. A triangle has legs of 5, 9, and 12. Which of the following do you know to be true? So very similar to the other one. Skipping over A, we had B and C. It is not a right triangle or it is a right triangle. So it has to be one or the other. So it almost pretty much corners into that one of those has to be the answer. It is an isosceles triangle, which would mean two sides are equal. And when we look at those, no two sides are equal, so we know that's not true. It's an equilateral triangle, which means all three sides are equal, and they just gave us three different values, so we know that that's not true. So we can automatically exclude D and E, and because of the way B and C are worded, we know it has to be one of those answers. So we start with our Pythagorean theorem. Our legs are 5 and 9. And if this is a right triangle or not, we know the hypotenuse would have to be 12 because it's the longest side. So we're going to plug that in. So 5 squared is 25. 9 squared is 81. 12 squared is 144. And 25 plus 81 is 106. So 106 does not equal 144. So this does not work out in the Pythagorean theorem, which would mean this is not a right triangle. So the answer would be B, is not a right triangle. Okay, number 9. How many degrees are there in a right angle? So this can be confusing because you could read it right triangle, which is the same as just all triangles, but they're just talking about a right angle. So a right angle is 90 degrees. So that answer would be C. Number 10, the longest side of the right triangle is what? So hypotenuse A. 11, in a right triangle ABC, one leg AB has a length of 5. The hypotenuse BC has a length of 60, square root of 61. So what is the length of the leg AC? So now they want us to do some algebra combined with the geometry based upon what we know of the Pythagorean theorem and figure out what the leg is. We have to work a little bit backwards. So leg squared plus leg squared is equal to hypotenuse squared. So 5 squared plus leg squared. Our hypotenuse is square root of 61 squared. So we start solving for this. 5 squared is 25. So plus leg squared. And then remember, square root of 61 squared. The square root and the square cancel each other out. So you're left with just 61. So whatever's under the radical. And then we want to solve for leg squared. So to get leg squared by itself, we subtract 25 from each side. So we're left with leg squared is equal to 36. Now that's not final because we don't have a leg by itself. So to undo the square, here we take the square root of each side. And make sure I'm still on the board. You can see it. So the leg is equal to 6. Square root of 36 is equal to 6. Which answer to that is D. Okay, number 12. In a right triangle DEF, one leg DE has a length of 12 and the hypotenuse EF has a length of 13. What is the length of the leg DF? Now, of course, we can plug this into the Pythagorean theorem. A quick thing is if we recognize this is similar to the 3, 4, 5 triangle, but it's called a 5, 12, 13 right triangle. So whenever a triangle has the sides or the legs 3, 4 and the hypotenuse is 5, we know that it's a right triangle. Whenever a triangle has the measurements of 12, 13, the missing side is going to be 5. Because that's a right triangle. But we can still plug it in and prove it with the Pythagorean theorem, so it's not like we have to guess. So one leg is 12. So we're going to take our equation and plug that in. We're looking for the other side. And the hypotenuse is 13. So 13 squared. So 12 squared is 144. 13 squared is 169. To get the L squared by itself, we're going to subtract 144 from each side. So we're left with L squared. And when we subtract 169 minus 144, we have 25. You take the square root of each side to undo the square. You're left with the leg is equal to 5. So the answer would be B. Okay, so this is all for quiz 18 portion. I'm going to do one more video for the second page going into quiz 19.